afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I think we may be the last regulatory session of the day. I'm so thrilled to be here, to have all of you here with us for this panel on the operational side of risk and resilience in this very complex environment that we're in today. I think our story is one of bad news and good news. The bad news is all the risk management is getting harder. The new technology is making old challenges harder. It's creating new challenges. It's making everything go faster. The good news is that the same technologies are enabling us to fight these risks in ways that we never could before. And so we are going to talk about that with our very distinguished panel. We have Diana Paredes of Suade. We have Siow from Tencent. We have Tobias Gondrom from UAB, and we have Valerie from Stripe. And Valerie, I'm going to start with you and ask you just to give us the landscape. What are the main risks that you're seeing emerging? What's emerging the fastest? Which ones are worrying you the most in terms of whether the industry is ready for them?
Thanks so much, Joanne, and happy to be here with everyone. I'm Valerie Wagner. As I lead product for Stripe for the Asia Pacific region, I think a lot about not only our customer needs, but also our overall operational resilience and the risks we're balancing and working towards. I'll call out two that are top of mind. One that's an internal risk and the other that's external. I think on the internal side, we think a lot about reliability. Ultimately, the core promise of quality in payments is uptime. I'm sure many people here, myself included, experienced the pain of the CrowdStrike outage in July. I know I spent more hours in the airport in Tokyo than I had anticipated that day. So it's just to say that the pain is really felt if uptime is not there. So that's something that we're thinking about a ton internally. It's especially important for customers in Asia and in Latin America, where reliability can be a real issue, especially when we're integrating a really complex network of dozens, if not hundreds, of partners across the ecosystem. And so, we do a ton of daily load testing and operating only at 30% capacity so that we can handle different spikes. There's a number of things we're constantly investing in. That's on the internal side. On the external side, I'm sure we'll talk about it a lot on the panel today, but that's really AI-powered fraud and how we need to use AI-powered tools to defend against that increasing threat. There's a lot more we can talk about there, of course.
Absolutely. Ken, let me ask you to add to that, and also specifically to talk about how AI is changing the game. And I know you've got thoughts on the need to be more proactive rather than reactive. So what are you seeing?
Okay. So thanks for having me. My name is Ken. I run the Tencent Cloud operations for Singapore and Malaysia. AI is a force for good, but it's also a potentially platform for the bad actors as well. So not only the financial institutions are exploring how AI can be used and harnessed for greater productivity, but so are the bad actors, the malicious actors. They are constantly looking at what would be the best way to exploit vulnerabilities in the system. So for example, we've seen the rise of deepfakes, right? So deepfakes is basically leveraging images, kind of superimposing on other people's images and then pretending to be that particular person trying to perform certain action. So deepfakes could potentially be a vulnerable point whereby they are exploited by malicious actors to try to break into a financial institution when it comes to, say, opening up an account. They could use a video call to simulate that they are actually that person, but it's not. We're also seeing the rising trends about how malicious actors are leveraging cloud computing technologies to drive AI to drive scams. And those scams could be in the form of very simple things like SMS, right? You get SMS and it's coming up on your phone and it says that it's coming from a legitimate bank and asking you to click on the particular link. Or it could be an automated call asking you to press 1 to speak to this person because you've committed certain action or you misplaced a certain parcel and therefore you got to click on option 1 and you speak to this person, but you click on option 2, you speak to the same person as well. So that's what we're seeing, right? Malicious actors are constantly looking at ways to leverage the power of AI to also look at how do they attack, how do they drive penetration into and to achieve certain negative outcomes that they want. So back to your question, right? Financial institutions really need to take a proactive approach in terms of being more proactive, being more preventive rather than being reactive, and that means constantly being in step ahead of the curve, anticipating what potentially, what kind of attacks or what kind of malicious actors would be doing to actually break into the system. So by being ahead of the curve, by understanding some of the rising trends, financial institutions will generally tend to be much better off than being just reactive and trying to catch up on things that happen to them, right?
Do you have a concrete suggestion on how to get ahead of the curve on this? What's the action step that people should take away?
Yeah. So, I'll give 2 examples. One would be penetration testing. So how do they make sure that they're constantly proactively testing to look at are they securing the endpoints? Are they securing the systems? Are they securing the cybersecurity posture? Are they putting in place the right set of parameters to protect the environment? And don't wait for things to happen. You got to proactively think about potentially what could be the scenarios, yeah? And the second area I would just call out, it would be really looking at the broader trends, because what could already happen in, say, in another country may just be the beginning of, say, Singapore, right? So, for example, what could be some of the common use cases or threats that has already occurred in China? China has a very big population. It has a very mature financial institution in the big cities, but it has also got a very large rural population. And again, some of these folks in the sort of poorer regions could look at exploiting the vulnerable system setup in the more advanced cities. So again, look at what's already happened, look at the use cases, and then ask yourself, could that happen in a place like Singapore? Right? Could that happen in Singapore? Even though we may not have seen it, but could it happen? So, so as I mentioned, deepfakes is video technologies is on the trend in China, but so are deepfakes in China. But here in Southeast Asia, we're really just scratching the surface, just starting to see some of these surfacing. So rather than being reactive, can we take a more proactive approach to try to protect our environment?
Yeah. Diana, let me come to you. You might want to add something on that, but then I really wanted to ask you to talk about cyber threats. It's at the top of everyone's, or near the top of the list. What are you most worried about there, and what should people be thinking about?
I mean, I think that obviously some of the things that Ken just mentioned are critical. What I'm most worried about is really the ability for everyone to understand when something is happening, right? So we're talking about a level of education that needs to happen at a population level that is quite important. And so one of my biggest concerns is that when people that are dealing with fraud not really understanding that this is actually happening to them. Obviously, AI is a big tool that can be used for good, but also for bad things. But that's something that in some ways is so removed from a typical, the moment when actually fraud starts happening. And that's something people need to understand, about that there are deep fakes, that they are running a risk of basically a fraudulent activity all the time if you're online. And that's something that has to be taken on really by regulators and governments around the world. I think that one of the things that I'm concerned about as well is that there is an element of collaboration, which I think is quite important. Everyone, specifically in digital, resiliency is quite protective of the information they have. When you're thinking about cyber risk, it is really about, a vulnerability. The information that vulnerability is taking place should be something that from a data perspective should be shared as fast as possible to as many people as possible. And so what you find is that when people understand that there is a vulnerability, sometimes that doesn't come in terms of messaging as fast as really should be. And also in terms of the actual data and what actually happened, people are not always as forthcoming to share around that. So I think that collaboration, whether it is between the regulator and the financial institutions, is something essential. There's also an element of financial institutions collaborating with their vendors. We have seen, for example, so in Europe, we're implementing DORA as we speak. It's going to come into play on the 1st of January. It's around digital and operational resiliency, which is a great piece of regulation, actually. And there's been a lot of work that was done there that was very much a collaboration piece between the regulators and the Commission and financial institutions. But, past the implementation stage, nobody really knows how the feedback loop of information is going to change, right? And so when you're talking about technology, it changes so quickly. So you're also talking about an element where collaboration has to not just happen, but also it has to happen very quickly. So you are talking about being able to have a feedback loop and an iterative approach to regulation that needs to really adapt to the new bits of technology that come up. So regulators should really be upskilled and up to date enough to be able to create new regulation to deal with deepfakes and the threats of artificial intelligence, as well as proactively educating their population.
I want to come back to this point about collaboration because I think it's so critical. But first, Tobias, let's come to you to talk about operational resiliency. We used to have a situation where if an entity was offline for a while, it was inconvenient, but so what? And now the technology's changing, and so are the market structures, the number of players in the mix. What should we be thinking about there?
Yeah, thank you very much. And indeed, I think in the last 3 or 4 years, our tolerance for something not being available has diminished dramatically. If you're now offline for even half an hour and you just want to make a payment, you might be quite upset. I have a lot of friends who go out of house without a wallet. I'm German, I always have some cash on me. But many of my Singaporean friends are like, why? You don't need, you only have your phone and everything is in there. But that then has the downside of the expectations that you are always up. And there's a couple of things that come with that. Obviously, you can control what's within your own organization. But if you depend on others, and most of the time we actually do, because there's an industry ecosystem around us, and there's APIs and connectivity. And often our partners may have a different SLA in mind for the services they offer versus the SLA that we have in mind for the services we consume. And then you can get quite screwed up in the middle if you think you need 99.9999 and the other one, 99% is good enough. And your customers may be in the middle. Other things might be, I think in many cases for the industry is something we know. For our suppliers, we don't know so much. The other issue is for the customers, for the individuals. They may also have a very different assumption about how technology works. And then because they think, oh, it's like this, but in truth, it's actually something very different or it may not be there. Suddenly they may be very surprised if, for example, something is offline or there's a cyber threat or AI may behave very differently as you described. I'm not sure whether that answers your question.
Yeah, but it does. Let me ask any of you, which of these areas or others we may not have touched on worry you the most? We're in an arms race in many of these areas against risks and against bad actors. Are we doing what needs to be done, or are there certain areas where if we were going to look at the curve of change, the risks are getting way ahead of us and we need to do different things or invest differently? You look like you want to say something. Go ahead, Val.
First of all, a big +1 to the uptime. Stripe prides ourselves on having API uptime of 99.999%, but also like we hope that not to be a differentiator because we want all of our partners and the whole ecosystem to have that level of resilience. But I think coming back to Diana's point on the need for collaboration and data sharing to combat fraud, where there's very large scale companies like Tencent or Stripe, maybe close echelon, not quite, and even at a scale like Stripe, where last year we processed 1% of the world's GDP, but that's still like we need closer to 100% of data collaboration in order to truly be ahead of organized crime, really. Right? They're very organized. They're going to find ways to collaborate to stay ahead of us, and we have to collaborate more. And the scale of data and the way that we bring data together in a way that is not too onerous for companies of different sizes, or that is, puts the right incentive structures in place for participation. Like it's a really hard problem to solve that is going to take a combination of robust regulations and a lot of private industry collaboration.
There's something that
and then Tobias, yeah.
that I wanted to add. I think people have been mentioning to me the whole day that people are talking a lot about data sharing. That's essential, not just in the space where we're discussing in terms of operational resiliency, but as an industry, the elephant in the room is the concept of like data standardization, right? So it's years we talk about data standardization. If we're doing data sharing, but it doesn't make sense from one company to the other, there's really an opportunity to miss. So in order to really combat fraudulent activity in a powerful manner, data has to be comparable from one financial institution to another in order to be able to train our own models to detect things, to be able to really create the kind of models that, from an AI perspective can challenge fraudsters. And so the only way to do that successfully is if we start really tackling the data standardization conversation. So we've been working on data standards from the beginning of our company. We've been advocating for that. A lot of regulators talk about this as well, and they try to do efforts in that direction. But it is an opportunity missed, right, as an industry to not really come to the table, look at data standardization in a way where fundamentally, schematically, we should all be able to compare our data from one financial player in this whole ecosystem to another, whether it is the vendors, whether it is the financial institution, whether it is the payment companies. We should all be able to extract data out of databases and compare data and share it and use it to create better models.
Maybe here comes the paranoid. That's because I'm a CISO. We are born paranoid, so forgive me. And I agree, for example, when we counter scams, cooperation is very important, and data sharing is quite important. You know someone is a mule or a scammer. If you can share it with other financial institutes, you can basically take down these networks faster and prevent someone else being scammed. But here comes it back to your question, what's my greatest worry? My greatest worry is the safety and the security in the third parties that I'm engaging with, because they tend not to be very transparent in terms of what their cyber posture is at all times. So I rely on, everything is there, but I can't really validate. Or I rely on it's always up, but I can't really validate until it goes down. Some may not inform me that they are even breached. I mean, you can read the news. Usually it says like a few days ago this company X was breached, but I'm worried today about my customers, not like in a week's time. So coming back to what my biggest worry is actually is this integration across the ecosystem, and how do I secure all my dependencies on all these third parties I want to work with, but I want to work with without blowing up the kingdom.
Yeah, I want to come back to that. I do want to encourage the audience to give us questions, and I hate to admit this as a moderator of a tech panel, but I have gotten it out of the app somehow that has the questions, so if somebody could help me get back into it, I would appreciate that. Or we might have to do it the old-fashioned way. But on your last point, Tobias, what should be done about that? Is there a strategy that the individual businesses can take, or do we need a different regulatory approach? What's the answer to that?
I think it's a mix of things. the regulator is actually taking a look at third-party risk. In particular in Singapore, they have elevated third-party risk as a major concern. White papers, guidelines have been published. And the bank's taking notice, and I think the other FI is just the same. In addition, each of us as a company with risk managers, we are looking at third-party risk across the things, critical business services, and so on. Some of the things that I think come to mind where more work needs to be done is a more comprehensive, aligned notification scheme that you at least know something going on. Another topic is a little technical. It's called SBOM, Secure Software Bill of Materials, where you actually know what your partners are providing. Open standards for what standards other people are compliant to with security. So a couple of things come to mind and they can help. At the moment, it's still a very diverse ecosystem, and we spend a lot of resources validating each other.
Yeah. Did you want to add something, Ken?
Yeah, I think the one thing I do want to add is that a lot of companies are taking a very band-aid type approach to try to fix things. It is important for companies to look at architecturing their security and anti-fraud posture holistically, rather than being reactive and rather than taking a band-aid approach when things happen. So do they have the right security posture? Are they having the right mindset that there will always be vulnerabilities somewhere? Are they proactively testing the system proactively? Are they engaging potentially third parties to try to penetrate? Are they working with the regulators to ensure that they're fully compliant with the regulatory requirements on data protection? I think these are areas that financial institution needs to take into consideration holistically. Yeah.
I mean, the holistic part cannot be overstated, right? Because there is an element of stress testing that is very real. The conversation of, is a company too big to fail? We discussed this for financial services back in 2008, but there is such thing as well for enterprise software. And so, I mean, CrowdStrike, Microsoft, they are too big to fail, right? These failures happened this summer in very large companies. So there is a systemic element when we try to stress test, which in pen testing, I think we're only scratching the surface. And so this is, again, this conversation of collaboration. How do we stress test? How do we really pen test our systems against systemic vulnerability? Because that's really the big risk at the moment.
Might I add a few things with just one short thing on the stress test and the external thing. If you are doing cloud, and I bet pretty much everybody in the room is, check what is the liability of Microsoft Cloud or anybody if they are out for a day. I had some conversation, they said like, oh, you get a free day of service. I'm like, that's gonna help me a lot. And I think similar things you may experience with Amazon. So when you do the stress testing, I think understanding what the liabilities of your counterparties are can be quite revealing, I found at least.
I mean, that's the SLAs you were mentioning before, right? So the collaboration between vendors and FIs needs to really get to the right place, right? And so I think that smaller companies and SMEs have much larger liabilities in terms of multiples of contracts versus the standard blank out type of liability that you get from AWS or any cloud provider. And so something there, I'm not sure if liability is the solution per se, but I do think that it's something that needs to be discussed much more openly, right? In terms of if something happens, to get a free day of credit doesn't really cut it.
So let's come back to this question of collaboration and sharing of information, of risk information. It's very difficult. We've got, again, a very complicated, fast-changing set of circumstances. The regulators, I'm a former bank regulator myself, the regulators have a lot of challenges kind of keeping up with the cutting edge of these changes themselves. What are the strategies that we should be using more or using that we aren't now to enable collaboration while still protecting private information, keeping things secure and private? Did you want to start on that, Diana? Or did you want to, or Diana, or Valerie?
I'm actually curious for, I was going to point a question to Tobias because
please do.
the tension is between, well, two things. One, selfishly, the more consolidated data we have, the better. From a kind of industry perspective, at least in payments, I personally see the future as like the bigger fish continuing to eat the smaller fish. Like as someone who likes to think of ourselves as a bigger fish, like I'm not selling my Stripe stock yet, right? So that's like barely the tip of the iceberg, and you have to have that collaboration. But I'm curious, Tobias, like what do you think needs to change given the data security issues and the sort of differences in standards and the need to consolidate? Like, what do you think has to change in order to bring that together in a way that is both secure and, creating the right scale of data?
So first of all, there's always a bigger fish. And that includes global banks or whatever. There's always someone who's bigger. So we live in that space where we have that fun. I've been doing data exchange, data sharing problem. I've been discussing it with the EU kind of 10, 15 years ago already. And I think to some degrees it can be solved, but not fully. I think it's inherently, there's a game theory underneath. The one who shares is usually not the one who benefits. And there's some inherent challenge with that. Having said this, the way I think how it's, for example, quite well solved in Singapore is you have different layers, like an onion where you share. With a broad organization, you share like standardized things, the things that are not hurting you. Yeah? Then you have a smaller circle of trust where you like share a little bit more things. By the way, usually regulators are in that second circle. And actually they are quite up to date, at least here in Singapore. They are really up to it. And then you have your very core circle of trust who you fully trust, and then you get all the goods. And okay, this guy got breached maybe today or 3 hours ago, or this is how they protect it. You go for a coffee chat, but this is based on personal trust that okay, we are gonna not screw each other, and whatever our companies do, we have a code of honor, and I mean it's that old style kind of. Not sure whether that answers.
It may be. I don't like hearing that. It's not very scalable.
I can understand that.
but it's
Yeah.
if that's the reality.
Diana.
No, but I think Tobias is spot on, right? Because the conversation, I don't know if it's not really about the size of the fish, right? There is just good fish and bad fish. Definitely in operational risk, you have players that have affinities in terms of our values and what we're trying to achieve as an industry versus obviously the threats that you have in fraudulent activity. And so when it comes to fraudulent activity and combating that, so obviously financial services by DNA, we're very competitive. Nobody really likes sharing information. A little bit of an edge is almost a competitive advantage. But when it comes to digital and operational risk, we need to change our mentality around that because we all lose. Right, everyone that's actually trying to avoid scams is actually on the same side, right? And we should have a way to share that is not only relying on informal passing of sharing and information. It should just be okay to open up, whether it is with the consensus of a regulator moderating the conversation, between vendors, between all the industry players, the financial services, to have very open conversations about what we're facing, not just over coffee. Right? Or maybe over drinks that are sponsored by the regulators, which is something that the Singaporean regulator is very good at doing. But that's very particular to Singapore, I would say. So there is a shift in mentality that is very important, and that's what we should be promoting, right? Where, the only way to collaborate successfully is if we move away from legacy mentality to something that really allows us to share information openly.
I feel confident in saying that Singapore is admired around the world for having regulators who are so tech forward. Very, very impressive. We have a question from the audience. See if any of you would like to try this. If we had a crystal ball, what will be the RACI for digital operations resilience in an organization? Who's going to be accountable? Who needs to be consulted? Who's responsible? it's a complex question, but do some of you are there challenges in this that are resulting from it being unclear who's responsible for what, who needs to be at the table?
Shall I try my luck?
Yeah, go for it.
I'm not quite sure why it says crystal ball, because I don't think that's a future question. I think that's a today question. And I would say today my RACI for who's responsible and accountable for resilience is actually my CEO. And I'm not saying this lightly. That there's like actually I think all our companies, if you're offline, your CEO will get the trouble and you will lose the business. Maybe to break it down a little bit below that, for me, if it comes to risks, I always make sure that the responsible business owner is fully understanding what risks he's taking. Sometimes it's a little bit abstract and hard to understand what a technical thing means in terms of outage. And I try to scare them sometimes a little bit to make it more tangible. Oh, you might be offline for one day. Can you do that? And then they're like, what? No. So I think that helps then when you look at the RACI in this way. Obviously, technology has a similar role, but at the end, you need to translate it for the business so they can make a risk-based decision. That's as far as I can go. I don't know.
Yeah, ultimately the decider needs to be the business in making that risk balance decision, but it is absolutely incumbent upon those sort of first line of defense, second line of defense, experts to make the risks extremely clear so that the right business decisions can be made. But it's also important to have additional layers of governance in place, right? Like, for example, within Stripe, there's many business decisions that I make. There's many business decisions that affect, the region that I don't make. But also we have governance layers where, like, I act as a CEO of our entity in Singapore and Malaysia, et cetera. And so there are certain things that I will veto from a governance perspective. So having ultimately CEO, and business decision, but having the right checks and balances in place. I think Ken was going to say something.
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
was just going to mention about resiliency. It needs to be a partnership between the buyer and the seller, the financial institutions, as well as the solution providers. So at Tencent Cloud, we are coming in from a solution provider standpoint. So typically when we go to our customers, we will then paint a picture in terms of what we think resiliency needs to take place. Now, resiliency for us very much depends on how well are you able to plan for situations that you think may happen, and do we have the right strategy? So, for example, we expect that, for example, there will be failovers, or there will be data center crashes, there will be fires or physical safety breaches in data centers, and therefore we will be able to build a more scalable data center footprints, for example, right? So do we have the right multi-cloud strategy? Do we have the right hybrid cloud strategy? And by the way, we were not affected by the CrowdStrike Microsoft outage at all, right? And that was because very earlier on we have taken on the approach that we're not going to be putting our eggs in one basket. We are going to be looking at ensuring that we're spreading our risks in different areas. And that's where you want to ask yourself constantly, are you putting yourself into one single point of failure, or are you able to kind of understand that if things break, you will always have a backup plan? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you want to answer that as well? And then we do have another audience question.
So just quickly, the point around like interoperability, right? Being able to fundamentally transfer your data from one place to another, not putting all your eggs in one basket, having, alternative vendor strategy, all of those things are really important, but also to have tested that these things can happen in a case of emergency. In Europe, that has been a focus over the past few years. We have seen actually the regulators actively advocating that any financial institution needs to be able to demonstrate that they can, change from cloud providers pretty much, instantly in case something like that happens. But, there has to be some thought also in the fact that there's a whole educational element that does need to take place as well, right? In terms of people understanding, you were mentioning pen testing. From an SLA perspective, because people don't really get that, what you get as a vendor is that usually you're asked to pen test once a year, right? But that is one point in time, as in you might be vulnerable at, not vulnerable at 10 o'clock, but at 10:01 you will be vulnerable. And so in general, people need to just get a lot more familiar with just basic elements of vendor contracts and what they're actually paying for, and the fact that if there is a problem, the liability is close to zero with some of the very large tech providers.
May I add one thing to the testing bit? A thought experiment for you, because I like your comment about you need to test. And yes, we should. One thing I tend to do when people tell me, we are 100% resilient, we have backups, we have disaster recovery, would you mind if I unplug this cable right now? And actually, if you ask the question, they were like, wait a moment, we need to test this before we do a test or something like that. So I like your point, but it's sometimes challenging for them.
We have a few minutes left. I'm hoping to have time to ask you all for like one word of advice as well, but we have a question from the audience on using generative AI in this field. We touched on AI already, but the question is, how do you see the use of Gen AI in building operational resilience in financial services? Who wants to take that?
Ladies first.
Well, what came to mind is one angle. We're all speaking from the perspective of larger entities, but the longer tail of smaller businesses are potentially more vulnerable because there's sort of less of a cushion if something does go wrong from kind of whether it's a fraud perspective or an outage or whatever, and so I think it's the platform businesses such as Tencent's businesses, Stripe, et cetera, doing that heavy lifting on operational resilience for them. Also, we have the capacity to hire large teams of machine learning engineers and AI experts, right? And so there's one thing is internally facing to defend and protect ourselves, but also as platform businesses, it's critical to make these robust systems that ultimately are going to be used by the longer tail of businesses that need to rely on us for their own operational resilience.
I would broaden the question to not just Gen AI, but how would the use of AI in general, in terms of building operational resiliency? I will give some examples. Like, for example, if you look at the scale of Tencent and the services that we provide, WeChat, for example, it scales up to 1.3 billion monthly active users. So at that sort of scale, then what resiliency means for us is the system or is the application stable? Is it scalable and is it secure? Right? And within each of these buckets, are we able to apply AI to ensure that we have the right resiliency? So one example could be in security. We are able to look at network security and then applying AI so that malicious actors that are trying to attack us on our web application firewall, we are able to update some of these protection parameters on an automated fashion. So you got to train the model so that you're outpacing and faster than the malicious actors. Yeah. Another example from a scalability standpoint is that there will always be demand and supply spikes. So there will be peak periods where, for example, an e-commerce company is running a promotion on 11/11 and you see a spike in terms of demand. Now, if you don't have the right predictive model, then you run out of capacity, and that's where things starts to break down. So you're not very scalable in that sense. So I would broaden the question, right? AI and the application of AI can be applied in all of what I mentioned: scalability, the stability of your application, and your security, to ensure that you're able to be faster and to automate a lot of the system, which in the past historically could be manually managed, but now you will want to automate many of these managements.
May I?
Tobias, and then you'll have the last word.
I think, yes, the benefit of AI or generative AI is that you can look at a very large amount of data and identify early patterns, even if it's small things. You can find needles in haystacks. So from an operational resilience perspective, you can find maybe, oh, there's a weird trend going on here. Maybe I need more resources because in 1 month from now, there might be a pattern that indicates a spike coming later. I think in that way I agree that, and this for security, operational resilience, all of this, capacity management. There's a negative thing inverse as well. The problem with Gen AI is it allows us to automate things and get rid of, well, let's say increase productivity, which means you need less people to do the things you do. But if AI fails, you won't be able to have the people to jump in again. So I think in this way it might have some implications in a negative way on resilience, because we will rely on AI more and more in the future, and when it's gone, it might be quite painful.
Our time is up, so be pithy.
Very, very quickly. I mean, not much to add to what my colleagues just said. I think that Gen AI has a lot of potential to help us to stress test and to find vulnerabilities. But on a positive note, Gen AI is being used a lot to, for content creation and all sorts of random things like that. But, if you start using it to learn how to code, coding has become, the barrier to entry to produce decent code has actually been lowered thanks to things like that and things like ChatGPT. And so this educational point, I think, is really important, right? So the gap between people that understand technology and that understand enough to control the machine is really important, because it's not so much about reducing people from my perspective. What we need to really not lose is our critical thinking. And the only way we keep critical thinking is actually by understanding how the machine works. And so that's, use ChatGPT and Gen AI to learn how to code more easily than we would have 10 years ago.
Wonderful. Please join me in thanking our panel.